the value of the S&P 500, which is like, all stocks, the top 500 stocks in the US, in the early 80s was 85% or 90% hard assets like plant, equipment, inventory, those kinds of things. The value today is like 10 to 15% the other direction, right? So almost 85% roughly is non-hard assets, which would indicate, and this is like, the Netflixes and the Metas and the, you go down the list, all of those, there's no actual physical good or very few physical goods. And it's all about
people working together, people maintaining the IP, people improving the IP, people signing contracts to get that content to that's all human interaction is how value is created today.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Cincinnati Business Podcast, where we elevate the voices of business owners, nonprofits, and subject matter experts across the greater Cincinnati area, and brought to you by the Cincinnati Podcast Studio. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the Cincinnati Business Podcast. I'm really excited about today. I think I say that every time, but today I'm excited because we're talking about something that's near and dear to my heart, and that's taking care of people. And how do you take care of people well? And so today I've got Kearstin and Darrin. No, I said it. Kearstin and Darrin on the podcast from Cloverleaf. I told you I was going to do that.
It's okay. It's a hard name.
But I'm so excited to have you guys here because you guys focus on the idea of how do we take care of people well inside of organizations, and you do it through your software platform. So instead of me butchering exactly what you guys do, why don't you kind of walk the audience through what it is that you guys do?
I'll do it. Yeah. That's great. We use behavioral assessments, tools like DISC, Myers-Briggs, StrengthsFinder, Enneagram, right? These are tools that people have taken many times over the course of their life. We take the data from that, and then we personalize a coaching experience. This is primarily workplace specific, but anybody could use it. Mm-hmm. Personalize a coaching experience that comes into the tools that employees are using every day, like email, calendar, Slack, Teams, etc. And the goal is to really help people, one, understand themselves better, right? Because I think we could all use a little bit more of that. And then understand the people that they work with better. And so that they have higher levels of productivity, satisfaction, engagement, all the things that we know people will do when they're thriving, right? And they actually understand how they work and how they can work better in the specific teams and organizations that they're a part of.
That's cool. Okay. So to anyone listening, I think the big thing that I'm really hoping that you're getting is that we are talking about a tool that can really help you care for people the way that you want to care for people. And one of the things, and I don't want to dive into it quite yet because I want to hear what got you to this point. But one of the things I'm just blown away with is how intentional you can be with the tools that you guys have, and how often you guys have metrics and tools that give the ability of daily updates of how do you interact with this person you're going to have a meeting with today well, how those sort of things. So I'm excited to talk about it. But first, I'm curious. That seems like a pretty big step to go and start a company like this. So what brought you to this point? What was your journey kind of like?
Well, I would definitely say we didn't set out to start a company just like this. That was done through a lot of what didn't work and what helped people and what didn't help people. And actually, I like that you phrase it as what can help you care for people the way you want to. But most of the times when we are used, it's more that sounds like a lot of there's positive intent, right?
Yeah.
And I'm coming into this like I want to do well. I think that most people have that, would say that they feel that way. But I think also most people struggle to work with the people around them for different reasons. So it's more about overcoming some of those struggles and overcoming, not knowing how to communicate well with your boss because you don't feel understood by him or her. Or how do you really manage conflict well with this person that thinks really differently than you, or those types of situations. And then, yes, of course, it helps you care for the people around you as well. But it also just makes you more effective because relationships are really how work gets done in a knowledge economy that we're living in. And even more so with AI coming out and all of that kind of stuff, which we did not foresee 8 years ago when we started working on this. How we actually set about building this was we met working together at a great company here in Cincinnati called Epifio. We both left there for different reasons and ran back into each other, and both were starting businesses. And Darrin convinced me to give up on my idea and go with him on his idea, which originally was going to be, how do we use assessments for helping people find the right job where they're going to thrive in that culture, because culture is a pretty opaque thing.
Like more of a recruiting tool.
It would have been a recruiting tool, yes. Okay. And as we started to build that out, we got feedback from investors, HR leaders, recruiters of like, I do not need another recruiting platform. This is a very saturated market. It's not going to be successful. And then Darrin also talked with a number of coaches and consultants that he also had in his network. And those folks, as well as the HR folks, said, I love this team building aspect you've built here, because we had built a very, very minimal viable product, very minimum. And they started to see that promise. And so we just followed the market on, hey, if that's where you're interested, if that's where you would pay for something, let's dig into that. And that led us to understanding that, you know, hey, helping add someone to a team is one thing, but helping to change the culture of an existing team is way more powerful and a bigger need that the market needed.
Well, okay, you said a bunch of really interesting things there that I'd like to drill into a little bit. Like, first off, you guys said you had investors, so you must have done some sort of a round of fundraising. What did that look like for you guys? Because that's in the entrepreneurial space, that's always a hard thing. Where do we find money? So, like, what did that look like for you guys?
I mean, it was a long journey. We've talked to a lot of people over the last six years. And yeah, I mean, I think in the early days when we first started, we didn't have networks in that space.
No,
right?
not at
Either
all.
of us. And honestly, like in the city of Cincinnati, 6 years ago, at least, there wasn't a lot of venture capital or even angel capital in Cincinnati. I think that's changed a lot. And, you know, I think the funds that are here or even were here then are so much bigger. They're more sophisticated, right? They're, I think, even Centrifuge is a great example of that. Like initially in the early days when we first started, they didn't have their own fund. They were more of a entrepreneurship support organization, and now they're doing direct investment, right? So I mean, there's
and they have connections to other investors. So there's more and more investors in Cincinnati that can invest in you, but also connect you to other investors outside of Cincinnati to expand that network. But that's specifically thinking about being a high growth tech company and doing venture capital, which is a specific route for a specific type of company.
But I would even say beyond venture capital, there is more capital, broadly speaking, in Cincinnati. And I think there are more people in Cincinnati who are looking to invest in Cincinnati companies, right? Yeah. And so like in those early days, we just started with where we're at, right? And then over time, we continued to expand that network, and we talked to investors who maybe weren't necessarily right for us at the time. But, you know, I think we felt like there could be a connection longer term. And so we just stayed in touch with them and continued to build that network, continue to demonstrate that, like, hey, we said we were going to do something and we delivered on it. And here's the kind of the growth path that we've been on. And it wasn't just us. They weren't meeting us for the first time. And, you know, it was us telling them that we've done all these things. They actually got to see that progression. And I think we built a really strong reputation that allowed us to raise, you know, bigger and bigger rounds of funding with investors from, you know, both coasts and everywhere in between.
That's interesting. Okay, so then what would you say is the biggest learning you had in that phase? Because obviously, if you've never
in the phase of raising capital,
well,
we're still in it. It's like we've raised multiple rounds.
Yeah.
But in our first round specifically,
yeah.
The biggest learning, I think, is don't give up. Like, it's really, really hard to start from nothing. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to raise capital when you don't have capital to prove that it will work. You know, it was a lot of what could we build on our own, being the company on our own, being non-technical founders, building a technical company. And there were so many reasons to give up for like the 250 days or more that we were raising capital.
That's a really long time.
Give up a lot.
I think the other thing too is like finding people who see the world the same way that you see the world, right? Because oftentimes you're operating on a vision that like most people don't have or don't see. And so finding people who also have that same vision and that same kind of like energy and strong belief in that is like critical. So like in Cincinnati, one person that it really embodies that is Sue Baggett, who's a part of Queen City Angels. And, you know, she was somebody who in the very early days, even though we had really crappy product and, you know, this like kind of MVP, you know, really rough kind of prototype, really understood it and got it and believed in the problem and our approach to it in a way that a lot of other investors did not. And I think that's kind of held true for us at each successive round is the people who have invested have believed really strongly in it. And so I think finding those people who aren't just going to write a check, but who believe firmly and strongly in what you're building because they can bring that same kind of passion and energy to it that you do. So
I think that's a really valuable insight, honestly, because a lot of people who are starting organizations just say, where can I find the money? Where can I find the money? But I think almost in a way, if you can be just picky enough to say, hey, can you match our values at the same time? Like, and understand what we're going after because we want your help, not only your money.
Yeah.
I think that's,
I think another way that plays out is how you're building your business, right? I mean, because you can find people who believe in what you're trying to do, right? The outcome that you're building towards, but maybe would be comfortable running those businesses in ways that aren't consistent with how we want to build a business, right?
And how we want to take care of people.
That's
specifically.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So then you guys are going around, you have an idea of what your company is going to be like. You're shopping around for investors. You meet people like Susan. And, but then all of a sudden you're starting to get all that feedback. What does it look like? Cause the other name of the game, it feels like inside of business is pivoting. How do you shift your products to fit the market? So what was that like for you guys? Like, were you walking in open-handed saying, we want to just build something cool in this space? Or were you guys more like, no, we really want to do this, but the market seems to say this, and like fighting the change? What did that feel like for you guys?
Yeah, the way I would characterize it is we just viewed everything as like the next step, right? And so a good example of that is like the being in talent acquisition or recruiting versus intact teams. For us, like we didn't really change what it was that we were building. What we changed was the part of the market that we wanted to serve. And as we really kind of dug into that feedback, you know, one of the things that was clear to us is like, yeah, I mean, if you're just recruiting new people into a broken, dysfunctional team or organization, right? Like you're actually not solving the problem. And I think that is also part of that process is because you're going to get a lot of feedback and you're going to get a lot of opinions. And how do you sort through that and identify what of those things do we want to keep and what of those things are not relevant? Maybe that person's worldview or how they've done it before, but maybe isn't necessarily right for us and what we're trying to accomplish. So for us, it was really more about, hey, how do we help people thrive? And part of that is understanding the people that you're engaging with. Well, I mean, we can still do that with intact teams. And in fact, we actually can have a bigger, more outsized impact if we're improving largely because a lot of people don't have the opportunity to just change the people that they're on a team with, right? Like, you know, you can't just like, I don't want to work with these people. So I'm like, you can quit, I guess, and go somewhere else, or you could fire everybody if you're the boss. But most people don't do that, right? And it's very disruptive and it comes with a lot of pain and cost. And so it's like, how do we help you with the people, the ingredients that you have in front of you? So
I think also another way, Brian, that I would answer that is like, you know, do you alter your vision or do you stick to your vision? And I think the answer is always yes and yes, because whether it's investors or whether it's customers and what are they using and not using, what are they paying for, not paying for, you're constantly receiving feedback from all of the above, right? And it's really important to stick to your mission and why you are doing what you're doing. Our mission hasn't changed since we thought we were going to be a recruiting platform. It's to unleash people to do their best work through thriving teams. That has always been for us the North Star and what we really care about. And how that has actually like manifested in the market has been evolved. I mean, our leadership team conversation this morning was about like a key evolution we need to make to that based on some hard feedback we just got from a customer. You know, like it's always evolving because I think that's just core to a creative process. But I also think it's a beautiful thing, a hard thing for entrepreneurs to accept, but a beautiful thing because you get to create something better than just your own idea. It gets co-created in the world with all of the many people who touch and impact what you're building.
I think that's a great perspective on it. I think I was thinking of it as such a, I think sometimes I go into creating a business or a new idea in this bullheaded kind of, I want to do this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But seeing it as an evolution, I think is super valuable. But I guess I'm curious, like, to be so passionate about something like this, creating healthy, thriving teams, and to do it for 250 days, like you said, of trying to raise.
It was actually probably more like 300. I think it was 10 months. Like that's like about 300 days.
That takes a lot.
We have shortened that cycle, but
that's good.
Definitely.
It's not 10 months.
Now when we raise, it's a lot less.
Yes. But it takes some conviction that this is really needed. What was that for you that kind of said like, hey, this is something we really need in the market? And why people need it.
Yeah, this is an interesting question because I think it exposes a little bit of the way that we see the world differently and how we kind of navigate those differences. Yeah. One, I generally see things as like top down, like big market, kind of organizational level challenges and problems, and she sees the world very much through the eyes of an individual employee or just an individual, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's been really, really good and positive for our company and Absolutely. For what we've built. Yeah. And so I looked at it more from like, hey, the market side of it, which is, you know, and I could rattle off tons of statistics about that would indicate that like, hey, how we're doing it is wrong. But I think the bigger thing is like, what were some of those bigger trends? One was like remote and distributed work, right? And this was pre-COVID, so not a COVID issue, but just that like, hey, we're working through other tools like Zoom and you know,
it was WebEx back then,
WebEx
way back in 2018.
Oh gosh, I kind of had some PTSD moments every time it still props up from time to time. You're kind of like, really? Are we still using WebEx?
Still on WebEx?
Yeah. But I think that was one thing. I think the second thing, and Kirsten alluded to it earlier, is just like, hey, the value that we create anymore is in our ability to kind of collaborate together. Mm-hmm. You know, I take my skills and my experiences and put them with yours. And the outcome of that is so much better than just my worldview in isolation or my skill set in isolation. And that was only becoming more and more relevant, right? And it still is becoming more and more relevant. One of my favorite statistics on that is the value of the S&P 500, which is like, you know, all stocks, the top 500 stocks in the U.S. In the early 80s was 85% or 90% hard assets like plant, equipment, inventory, those kinds of things. The value today is like 10 to 15%. The other direction, right? So almost 85% roughly is non-hard assets, which would indicate, and this is like, you know, the Netflixes and the Metas and the, you know, you go down the list, all of those, there's no actual physical good or very few physical goods. And it's all about
people working together, people maintaining the IP, people improving the IP, people signing contracts to get that content to like, that's all human interaction is how value is created today.
Yeah. So then what would you say, obviously you seeing this from this larger kind of top down perspective, you coming from kind of the more individual side, what kind of said to you like, hey, this is actually a really good idea and I need to go after it?
I think we all know that generally speaking, if you go to a cookout at your neighbor's house and you ask somebody how work is going, you're going to get a lot of negativity. Like there's just like, we view work, generally speaking, as soul sucking. People there are out to get you. Like, you know, like it, maybe not, you wouldn't get somebody who said that exactly how I said it, but if you listen between the lines, those themes are everywhere,
100%,
right?
yeah.
And I mean, now I like to research on TikTok and just like look up workplace and see like, or hashtag work and just see what people are talking about. It's all complaining about coworkers. And, you know, in my early 20s, before we started this, that was just loud and clear to me. And then also like looking at the generation ahead of me and like my parents and their peers, there's just like, generally speaking, a lack of relational capital inside of those ahead of us, like less friends, less colleagues that you would talk to outside of work, less, I don't know, just not complaining. Like when you talk about people at work and you look at those ahead of you, like they mostly just complain like, oh, that person doesn't do a good job, or that I never get my deliverable on time, or, you know, like all of that kind of stuff. It's all just relationships. And so like that problem is still something I'm very obsessed with, because you spend most of your time at work. And so not only one, that sucks if you're depressed about it or like you're stressed about it, but two, like if that's how you view the humans you work, that you spend most of your time with, like how's that affecting your worldview? How's that affecting how you interact with people outside of work? So, yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well.
No, that's great. And so then why, how are you guys currently using your current tech platform to fix that? Because obviously you talked about Myers-Briggs and DISC profiles and all those sort of things, but like, everyone's familiar with those tests. How do they interact with the data well so that it can feel like they actually like working with the people that they're with?
Yeah, I think that, yes, people take those assessments. $4 billion a year is spent on them annually, and that is to receive a PDF, right? $4 billion on PDFs every year. And if you talk to anyone who's taken them, they'll say, oh my gosh, yeah, well, first of all, you're going to get your jaded people who are like, whatever, that's like astrology and it's not real. But even people on the other side of the spectrum who love it and say, oh my gosh, it really changed my life. If you ask them a few more questions, they're going to remember one, maybe two facts about their results and nothing about the people around them. And so
one, because it's not even something that they suggest that you would share that information with other people, right?
So
it's kind of like, here's your
it's
assessment
private.
and don't share it with other people, you know, and we won't share it. We don't see it, you know, and it's kind of
your
like
data. Like, you know, people, there's low trust inside of organizations. There's a lot of toxic cultures, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So people just keep it to themselves. And maybe you had a team session where a coach came in and did that for you, but that costs a couple $1,000s, and how many teams are really getting that? And so we just saw it as like, if you really talk to people about their workplace experience and you dig into the most recent conflict they had, it so often actually comes down to just a personality difference. Like that person isn't a steamroller, they're just an external processor. And that person isn't disengaged, they're just an internal processor thinking about it. That person isn't disliking you and your idea, they're just analytical and asking a lot of questions to understand it, not to ruin it, right? So a lot of those things could be solved if we just better understood those dynamics and those differences, and that the way we default operate in the world has strengths to it that we should be offering, and also the ways that we don't, other people do, and those have strengths that we want to tap into, and we can not only have a better relationship, but produce better work, get paid more money, grow faster, right?
Yeah. Well, I think when Josh and I, the co-founder of the studio, when we took the tests on your site for the first time and started to receive some of the content that you guys sent out, one of the most powerful things that I think I received from it was not only the fact that I understood what his type was, and even though we are like, not to put him in the box of the type, but at least what he tested as. But then to get the daily reminder saying, hey, you're meeting with Josh today. Remember, he thinks this way, you think this way. How can you support him?
That's exactly it.
That was amazing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because it's not about finding out a result or reading a report one time. It's about in the moment, every single day, having the right information reinforced to you, or the ability to like just search for the information you need. Like, why isn't Josh listening to me? Like, you could just type that into our platform and it'll give you some suggestions, you know? It's the fact that people are dynamic, relationships are dynamic, work scenarios are changing every single day. And so how are we, like we focus on how we build the product in a way that people can surface exactly what they need as quickly as possible to not only improve that relationship, but actually be productive.
So you guys are a tech company. Because that is your main product, I guess, is this tech platform. Do you find, this may be a little in the weeds too much, do you find that a lot of your team who builds the product are high C's on the DISC profile?
Oh, for sure.
For sure?
Yeah.
Is that just like your classic engineer stereotype?
Well, they have to be thinking about all the edge case scenarios, the tech debt. Like they're engineers, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, part of that is like they actually find enjoyment, right, in those details, right? And so like that again is the interesting thing about, you know, the historical view of behavioral assessments is, you know, it's of course they're a C on DISC because, you know, they're in a role that requires that and hey, you could do that maybe for a couple of years. Like here's a great example. I started my career in internal audit, right? And how in the world could an entrepreneur spend, you know, the first 5 years of their career in an internal audit function, right? Which is all about like checking in on things and looking at the details and validating that stuff is. And so like I was successful in that, you know, like I moved up multiple layers and, you know, and I was external and then went internal and, you know, I had a good career for 5 years doing that. And, but that was about as long as I could do that. Right. You know, and I think it was a great learning experience for me, but like doing that over the course of an entire career was not going to be successful for me. And that's really, I think, the power of this underlying data. If we can expose it to you in a way that either helps you understand that, we have a ton of people in our company who started their career in one place and have ended up in a different place. Like our head of engineering
drastically different,
was an architect, you know, someone who runs customer success for our coaching channel spent 10 years in construction accounting. Right. We love that. And like, we didn't go and search for people who had that career change. It just happened because they were attracted to the underlying problem and solution that we were trying to solve, which is, you know, man, I spent 10 years in construction accounting doing something that was painful. And, you know, I was, you know, not my best at. And so I think that's really the power of what we're trying to do, is to unleash that for individuals, but also help teams really lean into those differences so that, you know, hey, we can put somebody who has, if there's nobody on our team that has strong conscientiousness, and our leadership team could be guilty of that if it weren't for like Dan Chaney and, you know, Tyann Owings. And so like, but we know those things and we can kind of say like, hey, Dan, this is something we need your help on, right? Like we need you to bring this part of yourself to this team environment to help us be more effective.
And we've delegated work specifically on that, given responsibilities specifically on that. Not just because of the test results, but because we see how it plays out, right? Another thing that's really fun about it is you started with the tech team. Are they more high C on DISC? But it's also really fun to see those outliers and those anomalies. Like our head of product it is very high conscientiousness, but also on Enneagram, a totally different assessment. He's the creative type on that. And like, that's not what you expect from somebody who grew up in just writing code a lot, right? But it's very helpful, very, very helpful perspective that he brings to things. And that's just one example, but most of the times when organizations invest in these assessments, somebody will only get one. And then it is assumed a lot of things about that person are just fully encapsulated in that one perspective of them, when really there's multiple different perspectives of people. And the fun part about taking many different assessments is two people who get the same score on one are going to be very different on another. And there's just unique aspects of them to be like invested into based off of
largely because there are different lenses or perspectives to see kind of how we interact with our world, right? And you were mentioning before this interview about the chronotype assessment. So we call it energy rhythm on our platform. But the idea of like, when do I do my best work throughout the day, right? Like, I mean, being a C in DISC isn't going to communicate that to you, right? And so that's really, I think, the other element is like, hey, how do we come at this? How do we come at who you are and how you do your best work in a way that is multidimensional? And then how do we combine all those data points to really give you the best coaching in the situation that you're in today?
So one of the hardest parts about podcasting is the moment you stop talking. I mean, think about it. The majority of the work that you probably put into creating a podcast is in the editing phase. So what if you didn't have to do the editing phase? Here at the Cincinnati Podcast Studio, we help you just come in and talk. We do all the rest. We have the cameras, we have the microphones, we have the lights, and then we have the editing tools to create the perfect content out of your podcast. Not only do you get the full podcast in video and audio, you also get short form content that you can use across all of your pages in social media. So if you want to learn more, go to CincinnatiPodcastStudio.com/tour to learn more and schedule your tour with us today. Then what do you say to the people who, like, I used to be a skeptic of this sort of space?
Sure.
Because I, in my first full-time role that I had out of college, they just always loved talking about the Enneagram. They just talked about it all the time. And I'm like, oh gosh, it's this again. But then the more I started to learn about it, the more I recognized its value. And I'm sure that a lot of people you run into, maybe more your sales team, may run into the skeptics. What do you say to the people who are sitting in that space of assessments? I've seen them done. They're not that amazing. They haven't done a lot of work for me. What do you tell them that you guys are different?
I would say your experience is the experience people like that have, which is actually the people we sell to love assessments, invest in assessments,
which is nice.
But they will ask about, hey, we have some people who either don't like assessments or are really afraid of being known inside the organization. That's usually what it comes down to. They don't want their information shared. And we say, great, don't big brother this. Let social proof prove it for them. Let the people around them who keep talking about it and are getting value out of it, let them observe that and how it is actually not malicious or not just well, it seems based on nothing. It is actually based on science. And they'll see that based on how the people around them start to benefit, and then they can opt in when they're ready.
Well, and they themselves might actually benefit, right? Because if that person they were having a challenge with suddenly got an insight that helped them understand that person who is skeptical, right? It wasn't a character flaw, right? It just was a different way that they saw the world or the way that they interacted with the world. And they started to approach them differently, right? They're going to see and experience that. And I think we have tons of stories where we have people on teams who have had that same experience. Hey, I was skeptical at first. I mean, I hear it all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. I was skeptical at first. I tried it. I started getting the coaching, and it completely changed how I did my work or how I interact with my team or how I saw my boss or, fill in the blank. I mean, there's a lot of those.
And this, by the way, also plays out with investors who are is this real? Who uses these? And what is it? You know what I mean? And we've had investors be I was totally skeptical, but then I talked to some customers and was oh, okay. So you're going to, I think skeptics are fine. I think people have had different experiences. People have gotten fired over their assessment results. People have a lot of sometimes
baggage.
Really good founded reasons to be skeptical, or they know someone who has. And so it's the second degree skepticism. That's fine. And I think for listeners, whatever your business is, skeptics are going to be out there. Learn, listen, observe, catch up or pick up on the patterns of the things that you should take seriously, and respect that there's going to be skeptics. That's okay. They're not bad. They're not stupid. They're not against you. They just have a different life experience.
And it also could mean that we're not the right solution for them, right?
Absolutely.
They might not have the right culture. They, Kirsten's mentioned a couple of times about people having been punished or people having not feeling like they can be transparent or seen in the organization. That's a bigger organizational issue.
Yeah.
And we might not be right for that cultural context.
Absolutely.
And so we've regularly had that conversation with people either through the sales process or in customer success where it's hey, we want to make sure this is going to the places where it can be best utilized and where it can't be, in a dangerous situation. I would also say that like that is more of the historical approach to it, which is like, oh, you're a C in disc. And, you know, most of our product is really built to de-emphasize those things, right?
Yeah.
We're going to give you plainly written, plainly stated language that is more about how you work and how you interact with others. It has nothing to do with whether you're a C or you're an Enneagram 9 or you're a, ENTJ or fill in the blank, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the big things that we've been able to do with our product that has completely changed how people see behavioral assessment landscape, is because we're really taking it out of being a typing exercise, right? And to being more of a, hey, this is a development tool, right? This is something that you can offer to your entire organization and give people access to learning and development resources they wouldn't have had otherwise.
Could you give me an example of that plain language? Like, what does that look like to somebody who maybe
I don't have my
like,
phone on me,
or just like off the cuff? Like, what does that kind of look like when instead of them saying, "Hey, your teammate is a I on the disc profile, they like this." Like, what do you say in those moments to somebody?
Well, a good example on the I is, hey, this person, you're about to walk in this meeting, this person and 4 other people. And oh, by the way, this person is likely to not speak up, right? Because you got to, and we're not going to say this in the content, but because we know that the other people in the room are extroverts, right? But specifically go out of your way and ask that person a question to engage them in the conversation. They have something valuable to contribute, but you might have to ask or prompt that for them, right?
Yeah,
that's
like
an example.
It would say like, Raj is likely a deep thinker, not prone to speaking up. When you notice that Raj is being quiet, ask if they have a perspective to add. Oh, like that would be a tip that we would send. Except we wouldn't say they. We've stuck fully away from pronouns. But
yeah. Well, because as someone like myself, I am huge on the idea of how do we help people feel like they belong and are heard inside of workplaces. That is a huge deal to me. And it's exactly what you guys do for your work. Mm-hmm. And so I love that perspective of trying to say, here are the positives in these people. Mm-hmm. We have figured this out because they took these tests. Mm-hmm. And we want you to then be intentional to then pull that out of them.
Yeah. Hey, and by the way, we know that not just because they took that test, but also because they continue to reinforce. We sent 68 million coaching insights last year, right? Oh. And out of those 68 million, there's a feedback loop associated with it. So when we send you a piece of coaching insight, you tell us whether or not it was effective or not. Like, was it relevant? Did you learn something new? Did you put it into use? There's reflections. You can kind of journal on those things and say like, oh, here's how I can put it to use. And all of that really helps us better understand, kind of get a full 360-degree view on how relevant those data points are on your performance and your behavior on a daily basis. So it's not just because you answered a few questions a certain way, right? And I think that's one of the other criticisms you'll hear about the space is like, oh, well, if it's self-assessment, one, there's like self-assessment bias built into it. And I think the second thing is like people will say like, oh, well, I can just game it, or, I can, well, like to what end, So I think that is another way that we can kind of move past maybe some of the challenges, I think, with the traditional model there.
So then the question then says like, say somebody is really into this idea. They are like, I want this. I want to help improve my culture. But a lot of people, especially people in the C-suite, often say, okay, what's my return? Like, how does this investment help me? What do you normally say is the return that somebody gets for using your platform?
That is a big question. So like when we sell to folks who are typically L&D leaders inside of large organizations, and right now they actually are very hamstrung when it comes to data to prove their ROI. Typically, all organizations will say, and all C-suites will say, yes, developing our people is core. That's how we stay competitive. And of course, we especially need to, shore up AI skills and these other like hard skills, right? But then they'll also say, well, human skills are core and that's how things get done. And we definitely need to invest in them. I forget the stats on it. It's something like 85% of C-suites will say, yes, those are critical human skills. But then like investment wise, it's like flipped. It's like about 20% of actual development investment goes to that. And I think part of that is because it's so hard to measure and prove. And what a lot of our buyers are using to prove impact of any of their things, like a workshop, a new manager training course, is just surveys of, did you like it? And do you think it's helpful? And so that is actually a key way that we're trying to make our buyers bigger heroes inside their organization, because we have people interacting all the time with our data. And we can say, hey, you know, like these people, we've sent this many tips to your organization, and here's the rating they've given on if they're helpful, unhelpful, if they change their behavior off of it or not, all of that kind of stuff. So that type of data is pretty revolutionary in our industry. And that's been super helpful to people, as well as, of course, we ask like, we have like a perceived growth survey where it's just a few questions inside the platform. So as you're interacting with things, we'll pop a question on from time to time on, has your team productivity improved? Or has your team
sense of belonging in that team? Right?
Exactly.
Do I yeah.
Like a bit of a pulse survey type stuff, but it doesn't feel like a survey because it's just core to interacting inside the product. So there's a lot of different ways that we actually gather data that is game changing for our buyers. And we're actually working then with our buyers to be able to take that to their organizations on, how do you frame this? How do you sell this? All of that kind of stuff, because they just typically have no data.
I mean, the challenge of learning and development in general, right, is like when you make an investment in a human being, how do you know that that actually turns into some hard dollar improvement, right? Like, you know, hey, I'm going to invest $5,000 into this person through like traditional coaching, right? Like I'm going to get you a coach and I'm going to do these things. There's zero way to be able to validate that, like, hey, that $5,000 investment in that person turned into $200,000 in profit for the company for the year, right? But I think if you went back and you looked at, hey, what were some of the things that coach kind of spoke into for that individual? And hey, it helped them see this like strategy piece differently, or it helped them see that like, hey, the way they had this team organized was actually counterproductive. And, you know, it spurred this, you know, idea around a new product, and that product now is worth $300,000 in revenue that year. Those are things that are really hard to kind of draw those linkages, right? And that's a problem generically for like learning and development investment. One of the things that we've seen, and we even have, you know, a partner that's in the technology space in learning and development. You know, they were trying to make some cost cuts, and the very first place they cut it was their learning and development department, right? Which is like, you know, oh my gosh, like this is so counterintuitive. And if I were a customer of theirs, I would use that against them. But
big learning platform, like it's a big
learning company.
Yeah.
And so we're not going to name names here.
No, we're not. But you would know the name if we said it.
But like, even if someone in this space, that's the very first inclination or instinct is to cut learning and development and investment in people, then like, of course, that illustrates the larger challenge of ROI in the learning and development space. And we think we have an opportunity to really change that based on the level of data that we have that can kind of help quantify some of those things.
Also, for us, like in our space, there's this behemoth called a learning management software, an LMS. It's where people can go take courses through their company, right, on anything, conflict management, or like how to, you know, do a certain process inside the organization, to your sexual harassment training that you have to do every year or two. And that alone, people spend hundreds of millions of dollars on every year. What is the industry for LMS? Is it like, it's like 90 billion a year?
Not the LMS itself. That's the content inside of the LMS. It's 90 billion a year.
Yeah, that's just the content in it. But then the actual technology is, so it's like, it is a third to two-thirds of a learning and development department. A third to two-thirds goes into the technology and the content inside of that, of their whole budget, right? And if you look at it, there's less than 20% engagement in those platforms on an annual basis. So they're spending all that money, unless it's like you're going to get fired if you don't take this sexual harassment training. People are not logging in. And we had somebody was telling us a story of how like their LMS provider, they were talking with them and they said, hey, we have like a less than 5% completion rate on like people in our, less than 5% of people in our company have completed a course on your platform. And they said, oh, don't look at completion rates, look at start rates, because if they started a course and then dropped off, it means they got what they needed to learn. And they were like, that's a load of BS, because that actually means the course wasn't good. And so they left, right?
I'll go a step further too. Like there's data publicly available around the LMS space, like learning management system. And they do an NPS score, right? And for users that provide NPS scores, the average for all NPS systems was a negative 27, right? Which would indicate that like learning and development departments, by having an LMS solution, is actually damaging their reputation inside the organization, right? So when you think about like that's the baseline level of measurement and ROI for investment in learning and development, like we can go so much further than that. And that's part of what we're leaning heavily into, is to say like, look, we have all of these individual moments that we're coaching, 68 million of them last year alone. And being able to quantify the impact of those moments, right, on their experience at work and their experience in the team and their performance and the team's performance and the overall level of development for those individuals over the course of the year, like that's massive. It goes so much further than just a negative NPS score or less than 5% of people
and we also
completing a course.
We have a beautiful NPS score. And I think part of that too is, and we have super high engagement rates too, but way better than 5%. And I think that is a lesson that your listeners can take away from this, is like, it's not always about having the like a lot of times our customers will ask us, hey, what's your return on investment on this? And we'll say, well, what are you using for your LMS? And then we have a comparable there where we can help them understand like usually when people ask for ROI, they don't know what they're asking for. And so asking them back the question of how are they doing that on their other tools will help you understand the data you need to help them get to then have that answer for their C-suite. Because no C-suite thinks about ROI in exactly the same way about every single part of their business. ROI is actually like, if you think about it academically, it's pretty much impossible to prove on anything anyway, much less human skills. So that would be we got pretty weedy on our nerdy industry.
It's also fairly like raw for us, just because, I think it's something that we engage on every day with new prospects or with clients. And it's something that we're continuing to evolve.
We're super passionate about it because we have such a good answer, but we also are first to market doing what we're doing. And so we've had to latch on to what the comparables are for other organizations, because we're under a microscope, which we should be because we're something brand new. And they just really want to know, is it trustworthy?
So then what do you say to the people who fear the idea of a system like this, saying that they're no longer a fit to be in the organization that they're in?
We would never say that ever. There's so many reasons why you shouldn't do that, like EEOC laws for one, but two, like it's not accurate. Like the data that we have cannot predict behavior. Humans are way more complicated. So all the content that we send to people, all the tips we send never say, Kirsten is an introvert. Kirsten is going to be quiet in meetings. It'll be like, hey, Kirsten is likely going to be introspective, or Kirsten is likely, or might, or often. We always cloak it in, I don't know the word for that, but like, it's not extremes. It's not dictative. Like
you don't say it in certainty. You say it in like, in practice, this person is like this.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we're also never directive, right? Yeah. We're like, hey, here's this insight.
And here's something you could try about it.
Right.
But it's never like you absolutely must fire that person because they're not a good fit. Like it's nowhere near that level of can they fit or not fit? Because the truth is everyone can fit. We are made to be so diverse and complex and unique. And every team needs that. Every team needs somebody to bring a different perspective than just groupthink. And we're more trying to help people understand, how do you thrive in that? How do you appreciate that about each other, and how do you fully leverage it for everyone's success?
I'll go a step further, because this is like a huge passion area for me, and Kirsten knows it is, because we have created this mindset in the workplace that you need a star, right? I need to go get that 10x coder, right? That's a phrase that you'll hear.
10x engineer.
10x engineer.
That's a
10x salesperson. And reality is, and like I'll give an example. I love sports analogies. I know some people hate it, so I hope
Here we go.
I hope you like sports. But Sam Darnold is the quarterback of the Minnesota Vikings this year, right? And that dude bumped around 3 different teams: the Jets, Carolina Panthers, all of which were terrible teams, by the way. Had terrible ownership structures, terrible coaches. Like they performed terribly.
Be careful. Some people may hate you after what you just said. Right?
Well, I mean, it's a fact. You can go back and look at the records, and I don't think anybody would really debate that.
Here comes Darren's competitive side.
And the interesting thing is he also performed terribly, like shocking. He went to the Minnesota Vikings. He was a backup, wasn't really intended to be a starter this year. And through an injury with this guy that they drafted, who was going to be their starter, he ends up getting thrust into the starting role. He's had a phenomenal year, almost an MVP level season. And so, but if you had asked anybody going into this season, is he a star quarterback, right? They would have said, absolutely not. He's a backup at best, right? And what that indicates to me is that there is so many environmental factors. Anybody can be a star in their chosen field, right? If they're given the right circumstance to be successful, right? Do they have the right and tools, the right investments? Do they have the right manager and leader, in this case, coach, who has been a known person who has rehabilitated quarterback careers, right? Do they have the right offensive line to throw behind, right? Like, these are all factors, and football is just a corollary of what people are experiencing every day in
because
their,
it's actually
in their real
measurable.
world.
Football's measurable.
That's right. And it's on
Very
display
measurable.
for 30 million people to see every weekend, right? Like, you're that salesperson, like that. They're not on display for 30 million people, and there's not oftentimes the level of measurability around those environmental factors in the same way that there is in something like football.
So then, are you finding then more likely that the people who are actually actively engaging in Cloverleaf are finding that people are being put more in the right seat than they may have been before? Like there's that analogy of right people, right seat, right? Get them on the bus and make sure that they're in the right spot.
Yeah.
Do you find that you're actually seeing people like being more like reshuffled to find where their strengths are, where they find joy, where they find
the cool thing
purpose?
Is it often isn't the managers or the leaders making those decisions. It's the people kind of coming to their own conclusions, right?
Oh, that's interesting.
Because they have language and they have insight that they can put to it to be like, oh, that's why I really dislike this part of my job. Or that's why I've not been doing well at this piece, right?
Yeah.
And the other interesting kind of flip side of that is managers seeing people in new ways, right? Like, oh, I hadn't really thought about that person in that role. And like, I could totally give them this task and let's see how they do with it.
Yep.
And then they're successful and it's like totally changes the team dynamic. And they're kind of like, wow, okay, like more of that. And so I think it kind of works both ways. It's not just managers and leaders saying, oh, I've got this person in the wrong seat. But it's also because like the wrong seat is pretty like binary, black or white. And the reality is there's shades of, it's like what specific tasks are we giving people? What opportunities are we giving people to actually demonstrate that this is a strength or a skill that they can excel at? And
those changes don't happen within a week of signing up for Cloverleaf. It's a journey. It's a learning journey. And it is often not in the control of a leader to say, yeah, we'll just switch your team. We'll switch your role. We'll, like that changes your pay scale. And that changes so many things that like you don't have so much control over, but it is those smaller ththings. And another thing I wanted to say is, Darrin mentioned like it's people coming to their own conclusions. That gets back to what we talked about at the beginning of this. Whereas if you talk to anyone about work, you're probably going to get something negative. And people so often don't realize that they are doing things that are just naturally to them draining. They're weaknesses for them. And that's not a bad thing because they have within them strengths, but they don't know what those are. They don't know how to label them, talk about them, seek out opportunities within them. And that's something that like when you get our coaching over time, you start to realize some of those things. You get certain things reinforced. You try something new, it works, you liked it, and you start to have more language and more just like confidence in what to really seek out for your next career steps.
Well, that's amazing. I could ask you guys so many more questions, but we're running out of time. So my last question would be, who is this for? Like when you guys are talking, like obviously I think anyone could implement this.
Yeah.
If they have teams that they work on, this is amazing for them. But like when you guys are looking around trying to say like, who is this for? What is that market that you're talking about?
There are really, I'll give my answer first and then you can. There's kind of two ways to look at this. One is like who can use it is absolutely anybody who works, period. But we've built it for people who work in teams. We've built it to be very much relational instead of just self-discovery. And that is from the product perspective, something we obsess over is just that end user, that individual person, as Darrin mentioned at the beginning. When it comes to more like Structurally, who buys it and what types of organizations do we thrive in? Typically, we're looking at larger organizations and we're selling into talent management, learning and development, those types of departments and leaders. But we've also had a number of just like business leaders, you know, hey, I head up marketing, I head up, you know, this function, or I'm a VP inside this organization here, who just start to use us in that department. So there's many different ways that we've entered. When it comes to what type of organization is best, we've kind of alluded to this, but really, if there is a baseline of trust that has already been established inside the organization, that's where we're going to thrive. If there is a baseline of it's not safe to be yourself here, that's usually not going to work out for us, which often can be like financial institutions, but not always. We have a number of financial institutions where we do well. And it's been really hard. We keep getting advice of like, segment, choose the one type of industry that you succeed in. And that's actually not how it's played out for us. Like we could learn more from looking at someone's Glassdoor reviews than we could by looking at what industry they're in. In terms of where Cloverleaf is going to thrive.
I think the other one we haven't spent much time talking about today is other coaches and consultants, right? Yeah. People who are in the human capital space and who are providing services and capabilities. We can be that digital platform for them because coaches and consultants struggle with a couple of different things. One, how they make money is they charge an hourly rate. So they either have to charge more or they have to work more to earn more, right? And neither of those things are appealing long-term, right? You know, you want some level of sustainability. I think the other piece of it is, you know, I can come and I can consult with you and we could have a really great coaching session and then I don't see you for a month. And there's all of this time in between coaching sessions where Cloverleaf can be that engine for reinforcement and development, right? So that we can kind of continue the progress that we made in between sessions. I think giving them a platform as well to extend their reach and their influence and their ability to add more value to the clients that they're currently engaged with. So we really support that as well. And, you know, coaches and consultants are really great partners for us. So.
Awesome. Well, we end every single episode where we let someone say the elevator pitch of who you are, what you're looking for, what you do. So who wants to give the elevator pitch for Cloverleaf today?
I mean, I feel like I gave it at the very beginning. I mean, I can repeat that again.
Let's hear it again. That's your camera. Feel free to say it right there.
So we use behavioral assessments, tools like Myers-Briggs, DISC, Enneagram, Strengths Finders, the tools that you've probably taken many times throughout your career. We take the data from that and personalize a coaching experience for everyone in your organization in the tools that they're using every day, right? So when they're interacting and engaging with others, we're helping them be better teammates in that context.
Well, Darrin, Kirsten, I am quickly realizing, and from everyone that I talk to in Cincinnati, Cloverleaf is becoming a household name, at least in businesses. So I am really impressed with the work that you guys are doing.
Thank you.
And I'm very grateful that you guys spent the time with us today because I think everyone found a lot of value in what you guys shared. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Yeah.